Stories from the home front bright, keeping victory shining light on the Victory Homefront.
To all the Rosies and Homefront Joes, and welcome back to On the Victory Homefront. This week's episode was brought to the forefront by a simple but meaningful gift that was bestowed upon me by my lovely sister-in-law who happens to be visiting us here this week. And that is a family recipe box. This recipe box, I believe, was my husband's great-grandmother's. Nobody in the family is quite certain whose it was, but I did see a recipe in here, the earliest one that was dated from 1937, which would put most likely his great-grandmother. It could possibly be his grandmother's, but she would have been fairly young. So that is the inspiration for this week's episode. So now I want you to picture a dinner plate. Nothing fancy, just an ordinary American supper. Maybe there's a slice of meatloaf or a modest slice of roast, perhaps a pork chop. Alongside it are potatoes, green beans, carrots, maybe sliced tomatoes, and perhaps a piece of bread. If you were sitting at an American dinner table in the 1930s or 1940s, a meal like that wouldn't necessarily have seemed small, but it wouldn't necessarily have seemed unusual. It was simply dinner. But if you put that specific plate beside many of the meals we see today, particularly the portions we've become accustomed to in restaurants or even in our own home, something becomes noticeable. The portions are different. The meat portion can look smaller. The vegetables and other side dishes have a much more noticeable place in the meal. And the entire plate can reflect a different idea of what constituted a normal serving. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Portion sizes. Because when we look at the American dinner table during the World War II years, rationing certainly affected what people ate. But rationing is not the entire explanation for why those meals can look different to us today. Americans already had different expectations about portions, and that's an important distinction. Americans in the 1930s and 1940s, well, they certainly ate meats. This was not a country where everyone lived on tiny amounts of meat before the war, and then suddenly ate even less when rationing began. But what we're talking about is something different. It's the actual portions. The amount of meat expected at one sitting could look considerably different from some of the portions we consider ordinary or normal size today. And it wasn't only meat. The entire meal could look structured differently. That's something I've known for a long time. You can see it in old cookbooks. I saw it in the way my grandparents ate. And more recently, I've even seen more examples of it as I go through the recipe box. So I'm not discovering this for the first time that people ate differently. I'm just seeing another family's evidence, our family, of something I've noticed for years. Sometimes the ingredients were different. Sometimes familiar ingredients were used differently. And sometimes it was the combination of foods. Sometimes it was what counted as a side dish, and sometimes it was simply the portion. You can look at an older recipe meant to serve 4 or 5 or 6 people and look at the quantity of meat it calls for, and through modern eyes think, really? That fed that many people? But that reaction may tell us as much about ourselves as it does about them. Because what looks like a small portion to us may have looked perfectly normal to them. And I think sometimes as ordinary as a tomato helps illustrate what I mean. So my dad, and I believe I told this story once before, for my dad growing up, now he was born in 1944, so he was a World War II baby. He grew up with some of the side dishes at dinner would just be slices of tomato. And I've seen this in movies. I have seen this in magazines from the 1940s, even the 1950s, to where the side items were just incredibly simple. So sliced tomatoes could simply be a side dish. So could cucumbers, cabbage, green beans, carrots, potatoes, a relish, maybe something canned from the garden. Foods that today we might think of as an ingredient or a garnish or something we put alongside the real meal could actually be the important part of the meal. And even when those foods have a real place on the dinner plate, the meat doesn't have to occupy most of it. Now, I want to be careful here. There was no universal 1940s dinner plate. There wasn't a rule saying exactly this much meat and this many potatoes and this many vegetables. Families ate differently depending upon where they lived, their income, their cultural traditions, whether they lived in the city or on a farm, what was in season and what they grew themselves, and even what they could afford. But there is something from the period that gives us an interesting glimpse into how Americans were being encouraged to think about a balanced meal. In 1943, the United States Department of Agriculture introduced what became known as the Basic Seven. It was part of the National Wartime Nutrition Guide. Instead of building the diet around one enormous main item, the Basic Seven encouraged Americans to eat from 7 different food groups: green and yellow vegetables, oranges, tomatoes, grapefruit, or comparable foods, potatoes and other fruits and vegetables, milk and milk products, meat, poultry, fish, eggs, or alternatives such as beans, peas, nuts, and peanut butter, bread, flour, and cereals, and butter or fortified margarine. It wasn't a modern plate diagram, and importantly, the wartime Basic Seven didn't prescribe the precise serving sizes that we might expect from a food guide today. It was meant to provide the foundation for a nutritionally adequate diet at a time when the country was dealing with wartime food conditions. But look at the variety represented there. That tells us something. Meat mattered, but meat was part of a much broader diet. And that brings us back to our dinner plate. Now imagine a slice of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, sliced tomatoes, and bread, and perhaps a glass of milk. There's absolutely meat on there. It hasn't disappeared like in a pot of stew. You can see it, but it doesn't have to overwhelm everything else. Now picture a modern steakhouse dinner. Maybe it's a 12-ounce steak. That's 3/4 of a pound of beef for one person at one meal. Beside it might be a large loaded baked potato and a serving of vegetables. But the steak commands the plate. It's the centerpiece. And again, I want to emphasize that I'm not saying every American eats that way today. I'm just using that as an example to see how our meals have changed since 1943. Now, the contrast helps us visualize something researchers have actually documented, and that's the American marketplace portion sizes have changed. Researchers Lisa R. Young and Marion Nestle looked at historical changes in the portions of food being sold to Americans, and what they found is remarkable. The trend toward larger marketplace portions began in the 1970s. Portions increased sharply during the 1980s and continued increasing afterward. So these enormous portions that can look completely normal to us today aren't timeless American traditions. Our grandparents weren't necessarily looking at the same restaurant portions we are. Our great-grandparents certainly weren't. A significant expansion happened later in the 20th century. And you can see it particularly clearly when you look at fast food and packaged foods. French fries got bigger, soft drinks got bigger, hamburgers got bigger, packages offered larger individual portions. And the larger size gradually became familiar. Young and Nestle found, for example, that fast food portions were often 2 to 5 times larger than the original sizes in which those products have been introduced. And researchers returned to the question years later. In 2021, Young and Nestle compared selected single-serving packaged and fast foods with their earlier sizes, and they found that relatively few of the companies they studied had reduced their portions since 2002, when the first study came out. And all of them were still selling some portions as large as 5 times the size of the original product. Think about what that does to our perception of normal. If the hamburger gets larger, and the fries get larger, and the drink gets larger, and the restaurant entrees get larger, eventually the larger portion stops looking large, and it starts just looking like dinner. And then we pick up an old cookbook or an old recipe card, and we try maybe a wartime ration challenge, and suddenly their portion looks tiny. Maybe the question isn't always, why do they eat so little? And this is where World War II adds another layer to the story, because in 1943, meat rationing begins. Now, we're taking an American dinner table that already operated with different portion expectations from ours today, and we're adding wartime restrictions on top of it. Food had to stretch. During World War II, certain foods were rationed at different times. Meat, butter, and other fats, sugar, coffee, and other foods and commodities were affected by rationing and wartime shortages as well. As we know and we discussed, families received ration books containing stamps that allowed them to purchase those ration goods and when. And for foods governed by the point system, shoppers had to consider 2 different costs. There was the monetary price, and then there was the ration point price. Once meat came under the point system, that serving of meat represented something else, ration points. And that gave cooks even more reason to ask, how far can I make this go? Maybe someone gets a modest slice of roast tonight. Maybe tomorrow the leftovers become hash. Maybe a pound of ground beef becomes meatloaf, with breadcrumbs, cereal, or other extender helping it feed more people, even oatmeal. Maybe an inexpensive cut goes into a casserole. Maybe a ham bone flavors a pot of beans. Maybe bacon drippings saved from breakfast are used later for cooking or flavoring vegetables. And yes, sometimes the meat goes into the stew. Cooks on the Victory Homefront became very good at making ingredients count and for using every part of the animal. But many of those ideas didn't suddenly appear because America went to war. Meatloaf wasn't invented by rationing. Neither was hash or beans or stew or saving leftovers, gardening, or trying to make food budgets stretch. American families had been doing those things for generations, and families coming out of the Great Depression certainly understood economy in the kitchen. Wartime rationing made those skills even more valuable, and Victory Gardens added another dimension to the dinner table. By 1944, Victory Gardens were producing roughly 40% of the nation's fresh vegetables. Think about what that could mean at the dinner table. Tomatoes, beans, carrots, cabbage, lettuce, and many other vegetables. These foods weren't simply decorations besides dinner or an afterthought to the main part of the meal. They were a crucial part of the dinner plate. Those tomatoes could be a side. The beans could be a side. The cabbage could be a side. Literally just that, not in a fancy, trendy wrap. That was a side. Slap of green beans, maybe a little pat of butter if you were lucky, little salt. Bread could also have been a real place at the table. I grew up with bread and butter at my dinner table. It's something I don't see very often. Yes, when we go to restaurants, we get rolls, but I don't see it very often, I feel, in going into other people's homes. I could be wrong. I can't see the world. I can't see society, but it's not talked about as often as I remember seeing it growing up. So bread, again, could have a real place at the table, and the meat could remain one important part of a much larger meal. Which brings me back to something I encounter whenever I cook older recipes, or not even older recipes, but when I'm cooking here on our Victory Homefront, I am cooking things straight from the garden. It's a very much more simplified meal plan that I have talked about in a previous episode. So part of what I try to do with this podcast is not just study the home front, but I try to live it. And that means cooking ration era recipes or experimenting with meals from the 1940s, reading old cookbooks, and now going through this recipe box that I just started going through that belonged to my husband's great-grandmother, and seeing what these dinners actually look like when you put them on the table. But I also live in 2026, and whether I intend to or not, I bring modern expectations into the kitchen with me. I'll look at an old recipe that says it serves 4 or 5 people, look at the amount of meat and think, that doesn't sound like very much. And I know I'm not alone in that. You see a similar reaction when people attempt what they call a ration challenge. They try to live for a period of time using World War II ration allowances. And one of the things that can surprise a modern American is the amount of certain ration foods they have to work with, especially meat. And you look at the amount divided among several people and think, that's it? But there's something important happening in that reaction. We're looking at modern expectations of what constitutes a serving and applying them to a 1940s kitchen. Of course, wartime rationing matters. It could absolutely require families to stretch meat farther, but rationing isn't necessarily responsible for the entire difference that we're seeing. Part of the difference is us. Our portions have changed. Our expectations have changed, and researchers can actually see the change taking place in the American marketplace beginning decades after World War II. That makes a ration challenge more complicated than it first appears. Because perhaps the question isn't simply, could I live in the amount of meat they were allowed? Maybe we should ask, am I expecting to eat that meat in the same way that I did? If I expect a large individual piece of meat at dinner, I'm going to look at a wartime ration allowance very differently from a cook who plans meals in which vegetables, potatoes, bread, beans, leftovers, and garden produce all contribute substantially to feeding the family. And there's another complication when it comes to a ration challenge, especially here in America. There wasn't one single American World War II ration allowance. The system changed throughout the war. I have been asked, would I ever do a ration challenge? I've asked myself that. And I would have to try to figure out if I ever did it, I would have to pick a moment of time in World War II and figure out what was rationed, what was allowed then, because even the amount of ration currency consumers received could change. The point cost of individual foods could change, and it did change. Different cuts of meat required different numbers of points. A food could come off points. It could go back on points. And sometimes having enough points didn't guarantee that the item you wanted would actually be available in your local store. When meat rationing began in March of 1943, Americans received red ration stamps for meat, cheese, fats, and other foods covered by the red point system. Early in the program, consumers received 16 red points per person per week, roughly 64 points per 4 weeks or a month. So imagine a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 children. During that early period together, they would have had roughly 256 red points over a month. But we shouldn't take that number and call it simply the World War II meat ration because it changed. And the point value of the meat changed too. The exact ration cost of a pound of beef depended upon the cut and upon the point table in effect at that particular time. And then the system could change dramatically. In May of 1944, changing supply conditions allowed the government to temporarily make many meats point-free. Veal, lamb, and pork went to 0 points, and so did beef other than steaks and roasts. Then conditions changed again. In 1945, civilian meat supplies had tightened considerably. More meats returned to rationing, And during the spring of 1945, meat shortages became particularly difficult in many parts of the country. So when someone says, I'm doing a World War II ration challenge, there's actually an important question to ask. When? Are you living in May 1943, May 1944, May 1945? Because those could be three very different trips to the grocery store. And I think that's fascinating enough that we're going to have to explore it separately, because I'd like to know what happens when we take the same hypothetical family and try feeding them under the ration rules from three different points in the war. Not just saying they're allowed to buy, but how we, with the modern eating habits and modern portion expectations, respond to it. For now, though, come back with me to those two first dinner plates. On one is our 1943 home dinner. Again, a modest slice of meatloaf, potatoes, green beans, sliced tomatoes, bread, a glass of milk. And on the other, our modern steakhouse example, a 12-ounce steak, a large baked potato, green beans. The second plate isn't meant to represent what every American eats today, and the first isn't meant to represent what every American ate in 1943, but they help us visualize a documented historical change. The 1943 plate doesn't look empty. It looks full. What's different is the role each food plays on the plate. And when researchers tell us that marketplace portions began getting larger in the 1970s, grew sharply in the 1980s, and continued growing, and that some packaged and fast food portions eventually reached several times their original sizes, it helps explain why an older portion can look so surprisingly small to modern eyes. We're not simply looking at wartime deprivation. We're looking at a different food culture, different serving expectations, different combinations of food, different ideas about what constituted a side dish, different relationships with leftovers, different relationships with gardens and seasonal produce. And then, during World War II, rationing was layered on top of all that. That's why I don't want to look at a wartime recipe that contains what seems to us like a small amount of meat and automatically say, well, of course, they were rationing, because that misses part of the story. Maybe rationing definitely influenced that particular recipe. Maybe the cook was deliberately stretching meat, and maybe we're also looking at a portion that simply wasn't as surprising to them as it is to us. That's the distinction. And I think it's an important one, because otherwise we can accidentally turn the wartime dinner table into a story entirely about deprivation. And that wasn't necessarily what an American family saw when they looked at the plate. They might have seen meat, potatoes, green beans, tomatoes from the garden, bread, and maybe something sweet afterward. To them, they just saw supper. And we look at the meat portion 80 years later and say, that's all? And perhaps that tells us something about how much we've changed. That doesn't mean one generation ate perfectly and another one doesn't. That's not the point. Food changes, agriculture changes, prosperity changes, restaurants change, food manufacturing changes, families change, our schedules change, and over generations, our idea of what looks normal on a plate changes too. That's one reason I enjoy old cookbooks, and I am absolutely enjoying looking through this recipe box. It is so interesting to me. These things preserve details that can disappear from the larger historical story. Someone actually cooked these recipes. Someone decided that this amount served 4 people or 5 or 6. Someone put those foods together. Someone served that dinner to a family, and they recognized it as a loving meal, not a history lesson, not a ration challenge. It was dinner. And perhaps that's the most interesting comparison of all, because when we recreate those meals today, we're not only learning what they ate, we're discovering how much our definition of normal has changed. The Victory Homefront can teach us something about that. Rationing encouraged families to make scarce food stretch. Victory Gardens put enormous quantities of fresh vegetables onto American tables. Home cooks used leftovers. They chose economical cuts. They substituted, they saved, they reused. They made meals from what was available, and sometimes a relatively modest portion of meat was exactly that, a portion, not the entire meal. Their plates could be full. They were simply full in ways that simply look different to us today. And perhaps there's still something we can learn from that, because sometimes the most satisfying meals aren't the biggest ones. They're the ones shared around the table, built from simple ingredients and prepared with care. That spirit of resourcefulness and resilience is exactly what we celebrate here on the Victory Homefront. So I want to thank you for joining me today. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, come back and watch future episodes or past episodes, and share with your friends and family to help my audience grow. And until next time, my friends, remember that victory is in the everyday. I'll see you soon.